So guys, we're going to go into some stuff about Larry Elder. This is fair use. I'm going to bring up some things that come with slavery and reparations. And Larry Elder is a conservative. He's also a lawyer. He's been a TV host for years, or a radio host for years. And this is his take about slavery and the lies that are told to everybody because people don't know this stuff, and this is very important to get out there.
Recently, as you know, I gave testimony before the House Judiciary Committee on reparative justice, a fancy term for reparations. One of the many points I made is this: why should anybody other than Democrats pay a dime? After all, out of the 350,000,
and that's a fact, why should anyone other than Democrats pay?
Slave owners of the estimated 4 million slaves in 1860, near as we could figure out, virtually none of them was a Republican.
None of them.
Here's my incendiary fact. In 1860, which is the year before the Civil War, no Republican owned a slave. Now notice I'm not saying that no Republican leader owned a slave. I'm saying that no Republican in the United States owned a slave. And if that's true, it means that all the slaves in the country, there were 4 million at the time, this was the zenith of American slavery, 4 million slaves were all owned by Democrats.
Now, when Dinesh made that claim, he got hammered and sent scholars all over the world scouring around to prove him wrong. And they did prove him wrong. Turned out there might have been maybe 8 Republicans out of the 350,000 estimated slave owners.
So let's think about that. So out of 350,000 slave owners in 1860, there was 8 Republicans, quote unquote, 8 Republicans. So again, in the country, there was only 350,000 slave owners, which is not a lot of people, even in 1860. Only 8 were Republicans. So if there was reparations, then why would everyone in the United States have to pay for slavery?
Or slave-owning families in 1860. Not a whole lot to brag about. Maybe Brian Williams can tell us what fraction of 1% that is. This brings us to the all-important 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And what role did the Democrats play in getting them passed?
Well, the 3 Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th. The 13th abolished slavery. The 14th established the principle of equal citizenship. The 15th tries to give black men the right to vote. These are all things which the federal government couldn't have conceived of doing before the Civil War. But the war itself empowers the national government, and the abolition of slavery leads, after a terrible political struggle, to the incorporation of black Americans as equal citizens of the society. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments each ends with a clause saying Congress shall have the power to enforce this amendment. In other words, it gives Congress the right to protect the basic rights of American citizens. And even though those basic rights of blacks were soon violated and taken away, really, in many of the southern states, nonetheless, those amendments remain in the Constitution, and a century later, they would be the basis, the legal constitutional basis for the Civil Rights Revolution of the 19th.
So let's get this straight. So after the Civil War, the South was still Democrat even after the Civil War, and it was the Democrats that took the southern states that stopped the rights of blacks for the most part. When you look at the Civil Rights Movement, it really started in the South.
1960s, 100 years later, those amendments, Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts during Reconstruction, said were sleeping giants in the Constitution. And they did sleep for a long time, but then they were reawakened by the Civil Rights Movement and became the basis for the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s.
Now, to answer my own question, what role did Democrats play in getting the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passed? Answer: none. They opposed all 3 amendments.
Johnson and the Democratic Party were unified in their opposition to the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which gave blacks citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which gave blacks the vote. All three passed only because of universal Republican support.
Democrats
So, so only Republicans voted to get those bills passed. And if you go and look at who voted for the Civil Rights Bill in the 1960s, it was all Republicans. It was mostly Democrat. It was there might have been a few Democrats, but it was mostly Republicans that voted to get that law passed. So, again, this idea that, like, you hear all the time that Republicans are racist, they're racist, they're racist, they're racist. It's not the case. It's not the case. And this goes back to showing you that slavery and the way that racial things are taught in this country are not true.
founded the KKK, you know.
Today's Democratic Party believes that government has an important role to play in society. It fights against economic inequality. It advocates policies that battle racial and gender discrimination. But it wasn't always this way. The Democratic Party was once the party of white supremacy.
So here, this right here is a poster from that time period. The two platforms. So you have the Democratic Party on the left, which is a white guy, is for the whites, and then you have a black guy on the right. The Republican platform is for the black man and the carpetbagger. So as you can see, this is what the Democrats thought. It wasn't until the Democrats wanted to get power and they realized that the black vote would get them into office more, is when they started to go for minorities.
Supporting slavery and the Ku Klux Klan.
And as a percentage of the party, more Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act, both in the House and the Senate, than did Democrats, who filibustered against it.
The only serious congressional opposition to the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 came from Democrats. 80% of Republicans in Congress supported the bill. Less than 70% of Democrats did. Democratic senators filibustered the bill for 75 days until Republicans mustered the few extra votes needed to break the logjam.
Bull Connor, the superintendent of public safety, Birmingham, Alabama, Democrat.
In 1963, under orders by City Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor, Birmingham, Alabama City Police used fire hoses and police dogs against children and adults engaged in nonviolent protests against segregation. The demonstrations were part of
Democrat.
Martin Luther King Jr.'s Birmingham campaign. Television news coverage of the attack.
Martin Luther King was a Republican. He was a Republican.
Attacks by police sparked mass nationwide protests.
You can never whip these bugs if you don't keep you and them separate. I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
Orville Faubus, the racist governor of Arkansas who refused to allow those little black kids to attend that public school, Democrat.
It was in September that 9 black students, 6 girls and 3 boys, became forever known as the Little Rock Nine. On September 2nd of that year, days before Central High was to be integrated, Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas ordered National Guardsmen to surround the school. Their orders? To only let the white students in.
I acted to protect the persons and property of the people of Little Rock.
Ever heard of Ross Barnett, former racist governor of Mississippi? Democrat.
We asked Governor Ross Barnett how long the state was prepared to finance the fight against integration.
As I said a while ago, we'll have to cross that bridge when we meet it, when we get to it. We can't anticipate that people are going to continue to violate the law. We presume that people will begin to control their mental and their physical faculties in such a manner and way that they'll have respect for laws of the various states when they enter those states. When these freedom riders go to Ohio or go to Oregon, they ought to obey the laws of those states. I don't know what it's going to cost.
Racist
it is
Democrats.
A great burden, I'll admit that.
Governor George Coley.
And again, right there, a Democrat back in the day saying he didn't know what it was going to cost, but the cost was well worth it.
Wallace of Alabama. Democrat.
In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
And don't get me started on the time that Ted Kennedy, Democrat, praised George Wallace, Democrat, because Ted Kennedy was thinking about running for presidency, and all of a sudden George Wallace's racism didn't matter a whole lot, did it?
For if there's one thing that George Wallace stands for, it is the right of every American to speak his mind and be heard, fearlessly and in any part of this country.
As I told the House Judiciary Committee on reparative justice, what about people like Obama, Kamala Harris? Obama's father from Kenya, an area of Africa where there was a lot of slave trading. Obama's mom from Kansas, her family owned slaves. Does Obama cut a check or does he get a check? Kamala Harris, her father admitted from Jamaica that his family owned slaves.
So Obama's family owned slaves and Harris's family owned slaves. Crazy. Crazy, right? But it's only white people that are demonized, and Harris's dad is Jamaican. He's not white in any way, but his family owned slaves. But white people need to feel bad about themselves, right? That the real problem is all these white people that never owned slaves, and the less than 1% of people that own slaves during slavery that were Democrats. Everyone else needs to feel guilty about it. Okay, it makes sense.
Does Kamala Harris cut a check or she get a check? It all becomes so very complicated, doesn't it? A couple of ending points. I kept hearing over and over again that slavery has existed in America for 400 years. Well, America has not existed for 400 years. America was founded in 1787. Slavery ended 1865, substantially less than 400 years. Also, there's this problem. From whom are you going to ultimately get all this money? Because slavery existed all over the world from the beginning of human history. Talk about a cross current of money going back and forth. Consider this. The Arab slave trade lasted centuries before the European.
Yeah, so I've made this point before on other streams and other videos that the Arab slave trade started well before the European slave trade. And I made a point on Kevin Insel's second channel about there were more white slaves taken into Africa during the time of the European slave trade to America than there were blacks taken from Africa to America.
European slave trade and lasted afterwards. And more blacks were taken out of Africa for the Arab slave trade than Europeans took out of Africa and transported to North America.
This is the story of the slave trade between Europe and Africa, a tragic tale of coastal villages raided and men, women and children carried off into captivity, loaded onto ships, taken to be sold as slaves in another continent, never seeing their homes again. A familiar enough narrative, except that in this case, the villages being depopulated in this way were English, and slave traders arrived in ships which had sailed from Africa, long before the British ever became involved in the slave trade.
So let's make this very clear what you just said. Ships from Africa came to Europe and were taking slaves from Europe back to Africa before the English ever got into the slave trade, before Europe ever got into the slave trade. Before white people were in the slave trade in Africa, there were African ships coming to Europe. That is what he just said.
Slavers out of Africa were raiding not only the British Isles, but many other European countries. From Iceland to Malta, Ireland to Spain, and Italy to the Netherlands, carrying off white slaves to be sold in the slave markets of Africa.
The truth can be horribly complicated. What are your thoughts? And don't forget, we have been
Shout out to Larry Elder. He's a great conservative personality. What the main reason that I made this video is about is because he highlights a lot of this stuff that is just it's being told to everyone as a lie. every race has been enslaved or been a slave or been in the slave trade. It goes to every single group. You had ships from Africa going to Europe. You had Europe ships going to Africa to America. You've got Muslims that were doing slave trades into Africa. You have Muslims that are in the slave trade now. The Arab slave trade is still going on in Africa as we speak. There are slaves in China. There's still slavery that's going on in America. Or not, well, there's human trafficking in America, so there's that. There's slavery all over the world since the beginning of time until today. And this idea of painting this narrative about the white man when less than 1% of people own slaves. So all this narrative is being taught is to keep people divided, because the more that we're divided, the more that we don't pay attention to what the government is actually doing. And it's the crabs in a barrel mentality. If we're arguing among each other, then we're not working together, because as we the people, we control the government. The government works for us. We elect them to work for us. We could build and do so much more for so many more people if we actually just got along and stopped buying into this bullshit narrative that they keep trying to feed us. Go do your own research. Go look into this stuff yourself. You have to always listen to who's telling you what. Don't believe me, don't believe Larry, go look into this stuff. A lot of the people that are teaching these ideas about the white man and racism and this and that, all they're doing is they want to keep you down. They're trying to profit off of your misery. I'll give you a great example. Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton and Black Lives Matter. These are great examples. Black Lives Matter raised a bunch of money during the protests and riots of last year. And none of that money went to any black business or any black family. It went to the Democratic Party. As always, guys, stay savage.